Hey Eagle fans, it's EaglefanKarl. This is going to be the last video I'm going to put up before the start of free agency, which starts this coming Thursday, March 9th. But I sort of wanted to do a recap of everything I've gone over the last several weeks, going through the team position by position. If you've missed any of those, I'll put a link up there in the corner to the entire playlist so that you can see, I think it was 6 videos I had done on the series of various positions. The one area I really didn't touch on was the 3 special teams guys, being Caleb Sturgis, the kicker, Donnie Jones, our punter, and John Dorenbos, our long snapper. There's really nothing to discuss there. They're all under contract for this coming year. In the case of John Dorenbos, you're not going to get rid of him because he just signed a new deal, so he's actually a negative number. If you, in other words, he costs more to cut him than it does to keep him. And all of them have rather favorable deals, so there's really no reason that you'd want to go ahead and move on from any of them. So that's really the story as it relates to the special teams guys. There's really nothing to be said there. I think they all performed great, so there's no reason I think you'd want to make a change anyway. But at any rate, that's the story with the special teams. We don't want to leave them completely out of the conversation. But the Eagles do have a lot of needs in the other areas, which I've talked about quite a bit in the other videos. And as we go into free agency, it's going to be sort of interesting to see what they do, because the Eagles do have some cap issues. The NFL has put the salary cap this year at $167 million. The Eagles do have a carryover from last year, which is just under $8 million or $7.9 million that they're going to be carrying over. So the Eagles' actual cap number for the 2017 season is actually going to be just under $175 million. But you do have to obviously take some things into consideration. First of all, you've got to take into account their dead money. They have dead money that essentially is money that counts against the cap for players that are no longer on the team, signing bonuses and such that never got counted, that are going to be hitting them this season. As for the dead cap, the Eagles' dead cap number for 2017 is $7.3 million. So basically, it almost wipes out that entire carry forward they had. If you really want the sad news about it, the majority of that is Sam Bradford at $5.5 million that he will count against the cap for us this year. So even though we are getting a first-round draft pick for him, unfortunately, it's going to be coming at a price for this coming year, and that's $5.5 million against the cap. Now, when I was doing some research as to, what exactly the Eagles have in terms of cap room, I saw a bunch of different numbers, and it got a little confusing from time to time, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's a couple different numbers that you can really look at when you're looking at the Eagles' current salary structure for the 2017. In other words, players that are already under contract that are going to count against the cap unless you make some sort of move. And that's because when you're looking at it, you can either count all of the Eagles players that are currently under contract, or you can look at just the top 50 or 51 or 53 or something like that number. Because really, even though they have a lot more guys under contract, the roster is limited to 53, so you're only going to have 53 guys on your roster. So a lot of places will take a look at that number in terms of the top 53 contracts and use that as the number. But you could see a couple different numbers floating around out there as to what the Eagles' cap number is. If you look at all the players under contract for the Eagles next year, it comes out to $162.1 million. But if you reduce that down and only take a look at the top 51 players, I'm using that because the website I use to do a lot of my research, that's the number that they're using. They have a number of $157 million if you look at the top 51 contracts, or just under $157 million if you look at the top contracts. So what does that mean in terms of how much cap space the Eagles do have? If you look at all of the players that are under contract for the Eagles, the number that you'll see floating around is $5.5 million. If you're looking at the top 51, then the number is actually $10.6 million is what the Eagles would have available to them to sign free agents. And honestly, to sign their rookies. You've got to keep that in mind as well. So really, when you look at it, that's really what you have to be thinking about. Is you've got to be thinking about, all right, you do have to have some money set aside to sign the guys that you're going to draft. So it really becomes a matter of, what's actually available. You might be showing that there's $10.6 million available, but what's actually available. So for purposes of our discussion today, I'm going to use, first of all, the number that looks the top 51 contracts on the team, and which is the 10.6 million. And to make the math easier, I'm going to go ahead and reduce that by 5.1 million. They usually say about 4.5 to 5 million is what you need to sign your rookies. So we'll just go a little bit higher than that and cite 5.1. That brings it down to a nice even number of $5.5 million that they would have in cap space to be able to sign any free agents. So that's the number that we'll be starting with as we're looking at everything. Now, you can free up space by releasing guys, and there are some guys that I talked about in the videos that I did that are really attractive people to get rid of as it relates to their contracts. The first one, the one that could save you the most money is actually Jason Peters, but they have made the announcement that they are going to go ahead and bring him back at his current number. When I did the video on the offensive lineman, I had said that I was either a proponent of bringing him back at his current number or cutting him. I didn't like the idea of one of the things they were talking about was re-signing him so that his deal would be more favorable this coming year. I go into a lot more detail on the offensive line video as it relates to all of this, so you can go and watch that if you want. But that's one person, Jason Peters was one person they could have cut to really free up a lot of space, but they're not going to do that. So let's look at some of the other names that get really interesting. So let's talk about some of the obvious ones. One of the obvious ones is Connor Barwin. He's going to free up $7.75 million for you. So that's a huge chunk that would get you a lot higher, and that already puts you up over $13 million in available space. The next guy you could cut to free up some space that probably gives you the biggest chunk is going to be Ryan Matthews. That frees up another $4 million. If you still want additional space, Jason Kelce would be another person that you could look at moving on from, and that would free up $3.8 million. And then probably the last big name that you could get rid of would be Michael Kendricks, and he would free up $1.8 million. So as you can see, if you were to cut all four of those guys, it would free up quite a bit of cap space, and you could do quite a bit with free agency. That's, by the way, remember, I've already taken out the money for the rookies, so this is money that would be completely available to sign free agents. And that would bring the total to $22.8 million that they would have available to them if they want to go ahead and sign free agents. So that's quite a bit of money that they can work with as they're looking at free agents and trying to decide exactly what to do. In terms of some of the other guys that potentially could be available, I've got some notes here. There are a couple other names that get sort of interesting. Ron Brooks is another guy that you could cut. He would free up $1.6 million. Marcus Smith, our first-round pick that hasn't done much, he would free up just under $1.5 million. And then a couple other interesting names that you should probably keep in mind. If they did decide that they were going to bring in a wide receiver, then Dorial Green-Beckham could be expendable, and he would free up just under $1 million. And Matt Tobin is a guy that they're probably going to have to move on from. He would bring in, he would free up $850,000. So that's almost another $1 million there that you could free up by getting rid of him. So those are all guys that could potentially free up some cap space if they got rid of them. But like I said, the big ones are probably the four that I have listed there in terms of guys that they could get rid of and really that would give you probably the most space and most to work with would be to get rid of those guys, and that would give you quite a bit to work with. So then the question becomes, all right, what are you going to do with that money then? If you've got that kind of money available to you in free agency, and it might be some combination of the three as well, but if you've got that much money available to you, what could you do with it? And this was all started by me. I started looking through all this and started crunching all these numbers because I wanted to see if they actually had enough money, if they wanted to go out and sign Alshon Jeffrey, because that's been the name that's been really floated out there. And a lot of people have been talking about in terms of someone who's available. Chicago decided not to put the franchise tag on him, so he's going to be on the open market come Thursday. And he's a guy that potentially the Eagles could target and go after and try and improve the wide receiver core, which obviously needs a lot of work. And Alshon Jeffrey is a great talent. I do have a couple of concerns. Number one is probably how much he will cost. Like I said, that frees up a lot of money, but he's probably going to want, at least in terms of what it's going to cost you, probably $15 million a year. So that basically is going to take up all of that room that you just freed up. And it means you're going to have to get rid of all of those guys. In fact, if you just got rid of Barwin and Matthews, that pretty much is all the money that you'd have left would have to go to Alshon Jeffrey. The only way you're going to be able to bring in someone like Alshon Jeffrey is to go ahead and get rid of some other guys like Jason Kelce or Michael Kendricks. Those are the guys you're going to have to get rid of to really free up the space that you're going to need. Because the Eagles are going to have to sign some other guys, if for no other reason than just some depth in some areas that they're going to need. And if you're going to get rid of Ryan Matthews, then you need to have a plan at running back, because Darren Sproles is great, but he's not an every down back. And, you know, we really don't know what we have with Smallwood. So you really need a back that you know you're going to be able to count on. And right now, there's no one that the Eagles have that could sort of fill in that role. A report that I saw out this week that really concerned me was someone asked Doug Peterson about Jamal Charles. And he said, well, they're going to take a look at him. You know, there's some familiarity there because of Doug being at Kansas City. And I just was shaking my head. I'm like, no, please, let's not do that. Let's not bring back a guy who you're getting rid of Ryan Matthews because of the injury trouble. Do you really want to replace him with a guy who's actually played less in the last couple of years than Ryan Matthews has because of injury? I think that's a huge mistake if they would go that route. I've also seen some people write about Adrian Peterson. I think that would be a huge mistake. Any of these old running backs, just forget them. I think we need to move on from that. But it does sort of raise some interesting questions as to what they would do with the running back position. And there's a couple different ways you could go. And that really leads me to my next discussion is really, what are they going to do at the wide receiver position? I've sort of explained with Alshon Jeffrey, it's going to be a little bit of a stretch to go there. But there are some other possibilities. And the one that's gotten a lot of traction over the last couple of days is the Saints looking to trade Brandon Cooks. And I would be okay with that. I think that would be a great move. He's a young guy. He's got a lot of speed, so he can stretch the field, something we desperately needed. I think that helps some of the other guys that we've got on the team because it takes some of the pressure off of them in terms of, some of the tight coverage that they were facing a lot this year. So it's going to free up guys like Jordan Matthews and even Nelson Aguilar to really have a lot more that they could potentially do underneath. And he's really going to stretch. He would really stretch the field. When I initially heard that, though, I was like, well, if you're going to do that, and you have to give up something again, because you're going to have to trade for him. He's not a free agent. You're going to have to trade for him, so you're going to have to give something up. My first reaction was, well, why are you going to do that when Kenny Stills is going to be a free agent? You could sign Kenny Stills, and they're basically the same player, and, you don't have to give anything up for him. You just have to sign him to the deal. But as I started looking at the statistics for Brandon Cooks and Kenny Stills, they are not the same player. In fact, I looked at the last 2 years because Brandon Cooks has had 2 years in the league, or he's actually had 3 years in the league, but really 2 years where he's been playing solid. And those just happen to be the 2 years then that Kenny Stills left New Orleans to go to Miami. So if you look at the last two seasons, there are the stats for those two guys. They are not the same guy. Brandon Cooks is clearly a better receiver. Now, you can say in defense of Kenny Stills, Cooks has got Drew Brees throwing to him, and Kenny Stills has Ryan Tannehill or whoever else the Dolphins are throwing out there. So I get that part of the argument, and that does have to be taken into consideration somewhat. But there's a lot to be said for those numbers and the difference in those numbers over the last 2 years. I think Brandon Cooks is clearly a better receiver, which really raises the question, what are you looking at trying to accomplish in the draft? And if you want to draft a wide receiver in the first round, then I think that you want to leave Brandon Cooks alone because you don't want to give up. The last report I heard is that you might have to give up a second-round pick for him. I wouldn't want to give up a second-round pick if I was also planning on drafting a wide receiver in the first round. It would sort of defeat the purpose because then you're not going to be able to address any of the other needs you have on your team. Running back, cornerback are the two other big ones I see. You're not going to be able to address any of those until you get into the third round of the draft. So I don't like any of those moves. If we're giving up a second-round pick, then I think you just sort of have to forget about wide receiver in the draft, and you really have to look at some of the running backs that are going to be available or some of the cornerbacks that are going to be available. So those are sort of the guys that I think that you'd be looking at trying to draft. And if that's what you're going to do, I'm okay if it's only a second-round pick. Ideally, I think the best, if the Saints are looking to upgrade their defense, someone that might need a scenery change on our team that maybe you could package a draft pick with would be Michael Kendricks. Maybe you give him Michael Kendricks in like a 4th rounder or something like that, and if they go for that, I think that would be even much more favorable, but it's quite possible that the Saints aren't going to want to let him go for that sort of compensation. They're probably going to want a little bit more. But at any rate, it is going to be really interesting. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens with these guys that I mentioned earlier in terms of who could potentially get cut by the Eagles. Those are the names I'm going to be watching over the next week to really see what happens with them. There is a caveat on 2 of the names I mentioned. When you talk about Ryan Matthews and when you talk about Ron Brooks, both of them finished the season on IR. And guys that are on IR do have some protection in terms of being released. You can release them, but it may be done with the hit, that you'd have to pay them a portion of their salary if you do that, unless you can have them pass a physical is basically what it comes down to. So if they can pass a physical now, then you could release them. Otherwise, you're stuck with them until they can pass a physical, or until if you want to just go ahead and take the hit and have to pay them a portion of their salary, which would then count against the cap, so you wouldn't get the full relief that I had mentioned earlier for those 2 guys. So that's what you have. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Who do you think the Eagles need to move on from? Who do you think they should, who should they cut? Who should they keep? Do you have any specific names that you're looking at in terms of who the Eagles should go after in free agency? Let me know in the comments below. Now that we're sort of going to be starting in the free agency period, I'm not going to have a set schedule in terms of videos. When I was going through the position-by-position review, I was trying to do one every weekend. Going into free agency, I'm probably just going to try and make some videos here and there as news comes down and let you know my reactions on some of the names if the Eagles do sign some bigger names, and I'll give you my reactions on what happens and what we had to either pay them or give up in a trade or whatever it was to acquire those new guys. But those are some of my thoughts as we head into free agency. Until next time, fly Eagles fly.